Dear viewers, assalamu alaikum, very good afternoon. Welcome back to the second half of the Talking Point TV show. It's now time for you to have your say. Do you think the government are wise in their 20% policing cuts? Is it what we need, considering the terrible economic situation we're in at the moment? Or are they going too far in light of the recent disturbances? Would it frankly be absurd to implement such cuts, which people like Councillor Zaffar and his party argue are going to affect the front line and endanger the safety of our streets, or the way in which we can deal with crime whenever it comes about? Let me go back to yourselves, Councillor Zaffar and Councillor Moore. Councillor Zaffar, of course, from the Labour Party, Councillor Moore from the Conservative Party. Now, Councillor Zaffar, you talk about a lot of the cuts that the government are implementing being absurd, being ridiculous. The extent to which they're cutting is terrible, is some of the stuff that the Labour Party are saying at the moment. However, isn't it down to your government's reckless spending, a level of national debt that you accumulated, that this government has to make the best out of a bad situation?
I think that's the argument of the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. Is certainly the argument that we hear month in, month out in the chamber here in Birmingham. And yet in Birmingham, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives have doubled the debt of this city. You know, when they took over in 2004, we had a debt of £1 billion. Today, in May, when we hopefully take over again, it'll be close to £2.5 billion. Nevertheless, the government, the Labour government, in particular when Gordon Brown took over, and Gordon Brown was without doubt the best chancellor this country's ever had, we had some very, very difficult circumstances to deal with. There was an international recession taking place. And Ahmad, if you have a look at how we compare to other countries in Europe and compare the debt of our government with respect to the GDP, Greece is at 150%, Italy is at 120%, Ireland's at 103%, and Britain are right behind the likes of Germany, France, and other big countries in Europe at 77%. So we're not doing as bad as some of our counterparts and some of our colleagues in Europe. But yes, we do have a deficit, and at no point has any parliamentarian or any elected member or any member of the party said that we would not be making cuts to some of the services. We would just not be making the cuts to the extent of this coalition government, the cuts that the police are facing, the cuts that other frontline services are facing. We've had many debates here on the cuts facing young people, the cuts facing disabled people. I think they're totally inappropriate. But yes, we would have been making some of the cuts. So I don't think it was irresponsible governance from the Labour government. I think it was the circumstances that we were faced with across the world because of this international recession, and we dealt with it. And we know of the Conservative record and the record what Osborne did in April when we had record borrowings from this government. There's not the amount of money borrowed by this Conservative government in April this year doesn't compare with anything that we borrowed. So I think we need to be realistic, and we need to be honest. We had tough times, and we did the best that we could.
Councillor Moore, when you accuse the Labour Party of borrowing too much, is it the pot calling the kettle black?
Well, I don't think it is, because the fortunate thing is that yes, we've had to borrow a substantial amount in April, but that's a result of
£10 billion, wasn't it?
Yes, I believe it was, but it is. That is a result of the mess we're in. Obviously, we could just simply say, all right, we won't borrow the £10 billion. We'll just make £10 billion more worth of cuts. And obviously, this is the issue. Labour seem to be suggesting, therefore, that we should be making more cuts.
However, Councillor Moore, are we really in as bad as a situation as the Chancellor of the Exchequer currently, George Osborne, and your government purport we are in, considering the figures that Councillor Zaffar has just mentioned, the low level of GDP that we have compared to countries like Greece and Italy and others around the world?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to point out, I don't think anyone who could be the greatest Chancellor of the Exchequer who claims to have ended boom and bust. That's a serious issue there if he thinks he solved that, and it's clearly shown that he has egg on his face today as a result. But I think what is key here is that we were close to where Ireland and Greece and everywhere else was going. There was the real possibility that our credit status could be downgraded, just like America has now.
I think it's important to mention the figures here. Our country was at, I believe, around 77%, and the level that we see in countries like Greece was well over 100%. Are you saying
nearly twice as much in Greece?
Are you saying that could have happened? Could we really have gone into such a bad situation where that would have doubled?
Well, the thing is that our deficit was very large in compared to those countries as well, and I think there is an issue here that the credit rating was saying it was threatening to downgrade our credit rating, which would mean interest rates would be higher. It would cost more to borrow. It would cost more to pay back the loans we have already. And this is the issue here, that it was just spiralling debt. This is what's happened in Ireland, and this is what's happened in Greece. They're in a situation where they can't afford to pay their debts. They're going to default most likely for a second or a third time, and there's a real crisis in the Eurozone as a result of countries spending out of control, not paying their debts, not staying within budget. And I think there was a serious issue that we were going down that line as well.
I just want to remind our viewers that the phone lines are open. The topic is policing cuts. We have drifted slightly towards the topic of debt, but I think whenever you get two politicians on from opposing parties nowadays, the top subject internationally, we're going to have the US presidential elections coming up next year and various other bits and pieces, and I think the top word that every politician is trying to get right is economy, economy, economy. So I think it's one of those unavoidable things that happens in every debate on these lines. Councillor Zaffar, going back to policing, I'm aware of the fact that Birmingham has one of the largest, youngest populations in the country, if not in Europe. How do you think, in your opinion, as somebody who has worked with young people for many years, okay, before I ask you that question, Councillor Zaffar, I do apologise. We have a caller online from Birmingham. Let me go to the lines and speak to Ahmad, my namesake, from Birmingham. Assalamu alaikum, Ahmad. What would you like to say this afternoon?
Walaikum assalam. How are you doing, Ahmad?
Alhamdulillah, very well. How are you?
I'm alright. Can you pass my greetings to both councillors? It's wonderful to hear the views this morning.
Thank you.
I just want to say that the both share a common goal, trying to work for the best for Birmingham. And I think they have shared a valid point. The cuts will affect both public as well as the general UK. And I think the government needs to get their act together, because we need the police, considering that the reason was it was obviously awful, and what happened with them three lads. But it was the police that arrested them offenders and put them to justice. So I think we really need the police, and we need the public to understand that the police is a valuable asset compared to the other services as well. But I just wanted to say that I think you're doing a fantastic job, and keep it up, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. That was Ahmad there from Birmingham.
Can I just respond to your namesake? I think the point made by Ahmed that the government need to reconsider their allocation of resources to the police force is not something that's just been said by the likes of Ahmed and myself. At a recent survey carried out by Cllr, 71% of the respondents insisted that the government need to rethink their allocation or allocations across the country following the disturbances. Furthermore, the same survey was carried out with members of Parliament and the current group that we have in Parliament. Over 60% of Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs fear that the riots may return during the current term in Parliament. 48%, that's nearly half the Conservative MPs, also agree with that. So the trust and confidence of parliamentarians, of the community, in what's happening up and down the country in terms of allocation of police resources is an all-time low, and I think the Home Secretary needs to reconsider what she's done with implementing some of these cuts.
Councillor Moore, obviously you, I suspect, won't agree with Councillor Zaffar as to the detrimental impacts that he suggests will come as a direct result of these 20% policing cuts. The Prime Minister previously did state that there were, at the time, just after the riots, no plans to review the situation. However, in light of all these surveys that are coming out now, Councillor Moore, do you think it's time for the government to at least review the situation?
Well, I think one of the key things that a lot of people here needs to be made clear is that I don't think the riots happened as a result of a reduction in police numbers on the streets.
Agreed.
The riots happened for a completely different set of reasons, and I don't think the simple case of putting a few more police on the streets would have stopped it. It would have still happened. Obviously, they may have been able to handle it better. That's something that could have happened as a result. But I think the key thing is that you can't have a simple case where you've got a police officer on every street trying to deter crime. That's an impossible situation, and I don't think anyone could ever afford that. I think we have to accept the fact that people know what is right and wrong. They don't need a police officer standing over their backs telling them, you shouldn't do that, you can't do that. They know what they should and should not do, and I think That's the issue.
However, Councillor Moore, if there are more officers on the streets, surely that naturally, it could be argued, deters people from committing crimes in the first place, as they believe that there's more of a chance that they're going to be caught. And secondly, doesn't it perhaps make the general public feel more reassured when they see police officers up and down their street patrolling the situation, keeping the neighbourhood or the area safe?
Well, I think there is a certain perception of crime, and that is a big issue. And I think a lot of it is that people perceive crime to be more than crime is. Crime has actually been falling for the last few years in the Birmingham area. And this is the thing, it's a perception of crime that a lot of people worry about. And yes, you can have police officers on the streets, and that can help deter that fear of crime. But I think there's also an important issue here that you can't have a police officer on every street deterring crime. Crime should be deterred anyway. You shouldn't have to have a police officer standing inside a shop that will deter you from robbing it. You know, this is the issue we've got.
Councillor Zaffar, would you agree?
Well, in terms of stats and perception, as far as I'm concerned, as an elected member, I'm far more concerned with the perception of people in my ward than stats. Yes, crime has been reducing in our areas, but the same people who were coming up to me in my ward 2 years ago and saying that they feel trust, they feel confident in the police, they feel far safer in here in Lozells, they feel safer in Handsworth, are saying to me today they don't, and that is largely to do with their perception and less officers on the streets. I think, in particular, elderly sections of our community feel far more safer when they see police community support officers walking up and down the streets. I know that we're not going to be able to have officers on every road, and I totally agree with what Gareth said there. But the level of cuts that we've already faced, you know, I go back to that figure: 63% cuts in my police constables in Lozells and East Handsworth ward. During the restructuring of the police, and further cuts expected when the cuts implemented by the government are forced upon my ward. You know, how many officers am I going to have? And then the other thing is the role of PCSOs, going back to what they've done, and you were going to ask me a question around young people before the phone call from Ahmad. I think...
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Just to clarify the question, as somebody who has done a lot of work with young people, of course you are slightly partial in the sense that you're a Labour elected member, and we should always remember that. We're not just talking to you in the context of a community worker here, but what do you think are the feelings of young people at the moment in places like your ward and up and down the country when they see the level of policing cuts at the moment, in your opinion?
We've got significant issues around disaffected young people within my ward. By and large, many of the young people that live in Lozells and East Handsworth are fantastic young people who are doing really well in their studies, gaining employment and doing fairly well. Yet we still have one of the highest levels of youth employment in the ward. Youth crime is far higher in Lozells and East Handsworth than many areas of the country. And going back, I've got one section of the ward where we've had a dispersal order for the last 12 months. And one of the reasons that the police haven't been able to deal with that dispersal order effectively, despite having stop and search and stop and account, and there's issues with how they operate that and how, you know, the legislation around stop and search and stop and account, they haven't been able to deal with the dispersal order issue. That's still lingering, and it's the biggest concern. I met yesterday, or rather on Friday, with members of my community and a delegation from my community with the new police inspector and the new police sergeant for my area. And the biggest concern was that particular area around disaffected young people and the dispersal order. So I think the gap between the police and the young people was huge in the 80s, 90s, and certainly in the early part of this decade. With all the investment made by the Labour government into neighbourhood policing, into PCSOs, into young people officers, so police officers dedicated to working with young people, that gap was reduced. But I'm seeing that gap increasing again. So the relationship between young people and the police is having a detrimental impact, and with these cuts will increase.
I just want to remind our viewers the phone lines are open. Are the government doing the right thing by implementing the cuts that they would argue are necessary, especially in terms of policing, or is it a completely ill-thought-out move that will result in our streets, or perhaps the perception of our streets, becoming less safer? Councillor Moore, do you think Councillor Zaffar has a point when he argues that if these cuts are implemented, it could result in that disengagement between the relationship that currently he would say exists at a very high level between the police and the young people in the community there?
I think the issue here is that why have we got high youth unemployment? Why have we got high youth crime? And I think the key problem here is education. We had 13 years of what effectively can be described as, and certainly I would, as I was educated during those 13 years, as a stagnant education system where unless you're capable of getting the GCSEs and the A-levels and going off to university, which the Labour Party was very keen on pushing, what happens if you don't make that? You know, you fall down, and this is the problem where we've got society now, where we've got a very bottom element of those people who weren't able to make it for whatever reason, whether it's because obviously they come from a poor or a disadvantaged background, or if they just simply weren't able to make the grades, or they didn't want to. The fact is, therefore, you get stigmatised, and I'm aware of this because a lot of my friends didn't go to university. That, you know, you get stigmatised. Today's society is solely geared about if you're going to make it in life, you go to university. But that isn't the answer. You know, it's not the only option. There are other ways to get through in life and do a fantastic job, and I know other people who have not been to university and made great successes out of themselves. And there's a big problem that the Labour Party have failed to deal with this problem. And, you know, obviously it's something that I'm pleased to say that our government is dealing with effectively, I would say. We're increasing, obviously, more apprenticeships, and obviously we've got the National Citizenship Scheme going through. But I think this is the key, that what happens with that bottom element of children who aren't able to get through the, you know, jump through the hoops of the education system of the previous government?
I think, I mean, if I can just respond to that, I think Gareth's being very unfair with his criticism of the Labour government. I left Holt School in 1997, and my results came out a few months after Tony Blair became the Prime Minister of this country. If you have a look at Holt School 13 years later, and then Labour investment being put into Holt School, it's one of the best schools in the northwest, where we've got an executive head teacher who's going out helping other failing schools in the area. When I left, the pass rate was something like 25%, 5 or more GCSEs at A to C. Today, it's more than twice that. So we've clearly seen how schools locally here in Birmingham and up and down the country have benefited. We've got Perry Beaches just down the road from where we're sitting. That's benefited hugely from Labour investment. And I'm surprised, you know, Gareth talks about apprenticeships after, you know, their government got rid of the Future Jobs Fund. I'm surprised, you know, the Labour government made a huge investment in terms of the Working Neighbourhood Fund. How was that managed here locally by the Conservative Liberal Council? Has that made a difference to people, to the lives of people? The investment was made by the Labour government. The project was run by the Liberal and Conservatives here in Birmingham. What has it done? Not made a huge difference at all. So the investment's been put in. It's about how it's been implemented by local authorities that have been run by colleagues of Gareth.
I think it's important for us to go back to the key issue here, Gareth, and Waseem, and I'll put this point to you again, Gareth. Do you think that these policing cuts will result in the relationship between the police and young people getting worse? As Councillor Zaffar would perhaps argue, it has been at a good level and is at a good level at the moment. Do you think it will result in these cuts?
Well, I would certainly hope that isn't the case, because I think it's important to bear in mind that when the police do get involved in the community, that obviously they do play, and they do a great role. Obviously, I'm very involved in the police in the communities in Erdington. But I think there's also a worrying situation where if the police come in, they do a lot of work in the area,